On a morning in the spring of 1718, a man stood on the quarterdeck of a sloop called the Ranger, watching the harbor of Nassau resolve itself through the dawn haze. The water was still. The air was warm and heavy, carrying the familiar stench of the settlement, wood smoke, rotting fish, rum spilled into sand, the accumulated refuse of 1,000 men who had come here to escape the world's rules and found, in doing so, that they had created rules of their own. The man was perhaps 45 years old, though the Caribbean sun and the salt wind had carved decades into his face that the calendar had not earned. His hands resting on the rail were thick and scarred, the hands of someone who had spent his life hauling rope and handling weapons. He wore a coat that had once been fine, English broadcloth, brass buttons, but the tropics had faded it to something the color of old paper. Beneath the coat, a pistol. Beneath the pistol, the slow heartbeat of a man who had made a decision he could not unmake. The harbor was full of ships, not merchantmen, not naval vessels, pirates, sloops and brigantines and a few larger vessels, their masts a leafless forest against the pale sky, their hulls carrying the scars of combat and the grime of months at sea. On the beaches, men were waking, hundreds of them, perhaps 1,000, sprawled in the sand or stumbling from the crude shelters they had built among the ruins of the old colonial town. These were the pirates of Nassau, the most concentrated gathering of sea robbers the Atlantic had ever seen. And the man on the quarterdeck of the Ranger had, more than any other single person, made them what they were. His name was Benjamin Hornigold, and what he had done over the previous 5 years had reshaped the economy of the Atlantic world. He had turned a half-abandoned island into a functioning pirate republic. He had trained a generation of captains who would terrorize the shipping lanes from Newfoundland to Brazil. He had, by some estimates, been responsible for the capture of more than 100 vessels. He had created the conditions under which a man named Edward Teach, a man Hornigold had personally mentored, personally elevated, personally shaped, would become the most famous pirate in history. Yet within a year of this morning, Benjamin Hornigold would accept a royal pardon from the King of England. He would turn against everything he had built. He would hunt down the men he had once commanded and see them hanged. And history, with its peculiar sense of justice, would remember Blackbeard forever and forget the man who made him. This is the story of how a republic was founded on theft and dissolved in betrayal, how a pirate became a patriot and how a patriot became a hunter. How one man built an institution that terrified empires, and then, when offered the chance to destroy it, said yes. Before we enter the story properly, we must acknowledge what we do not know. The historical record of early 18th century piracy is simultaneously abundant and treacherous. We have trial transcripts, newspaper accounts, colonial dispatches, and the testimony of captured sailors. We have the remarkable document known as A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 under the name Captain Charles Johnson, a work that has shaped nearly everything we think we know about the golden age of piracy, and whose accuracy ranges from meticulous to fantastical, depending on the chapter. We have the logbooks of naval captains and the letters of colonial governors. We have death warrants and pardons, cargo manifests and insurance claims. What we do not have is Benjamin Hornigold's own voice. He left no memoirs. He gave no interviews. His letters, if he wrote any, have not survived. We know him almost entirely through the testimony of others, through the men he captured, the officials who corresponded about him, the pirates who sailed under him and later spoke at trial. This means that Hornigold comes to us filtered through the perspectives of people who had reason to fear him, hate him, or dismiss him. The merchants whose ships he took did not pause to record his motivations. The governors who worried about his activities did not trouble themselves with his interior life. We know the shape of his career. We know the outlines of his decisions. We can reconstruct from the accumulated fragments a life and a trajectory. But the man himself, his thoughts, his hesitations, his private justifications, remains largely inaccessible. We are building a portrait from the negative space around him, from the shadows he cast on documents that were not about him. This is the condition of most historical knowledge about people who were not kings or generals or writers. The sources were not designed to preserve them. The sources were designed to manage them, prosecute them or profit from them. What remains is what the powerful thought worth recording. We work with what we have. What we have is enough to tell a story. Whether it is enough to understand a man is a different question. The world that made Benjamin Hornigold was a world in the middle of transformation, a transformation so profound that the people living through it could barely perceive its outlines, even as they were swept along by its currents. The year was approximately 1680 when Hornigold was born, though even this is uncertain. He was English. This much the sources agree on. He came from somewhere in the British Isles, likely from a coastal community, possibly from a family with maritime connections. The England of his childhood was an England still reeling from civil war and revolution, an England where the old certainties of monarchy and church had been violently disrupted within living memory, an England that was simultaneously expanding its reach across the Atlantic and struggling to control the territories it already claimed. The Caribbean, in 1680, was the most valuable and most contested real estate on Earth. The islands themselves were small, some no larger than English counties, many smaller than English parishes. But they produced sugar. And sugar, in the late 17th century, was the most profitable commodity in the world. A single Caribbean plantation could generate more wealth in a year than entire English villages would see in a generation. The planters who owned these operations became fabulously rich. The merchants who shipped their product became richer still. And the system that made this wealth possible, the system of chattel slavery, of stolen African labor, of human beings reduced to agricultural machinery, was expanding at a rate that would have been inconceivable a century earlier. In 1680, approximately 60,000 enslaved Africans lived in the British Caribbean. By 1720, that number would exceed 200,000. The transatlantic slave trade was not some peripheral activity of European commerce. It was the engine that drove the entire Atlantic economy. The sugar that sweetened English tea, the rum that sustained English sailors, the molasses that preserved English meat, all of it was produced by people who had been captured in Africa, packed into the holds of ships, transported across 3,000 miles of ocean, and worked to death on islands they had never asked to see. This is the world into which Benjamin Hornigold was born. This is the economy he would eventually prey upon, and this is the context without which his story makes no sense. The Caribbean of the early 17s was not a lawless wilderness. It was, on the contrary, intensely legalistic, a patchwork of colonial jurisdictions, each with its own governor, its own courts, its own system of taxation and enforcement. The British claimed Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, and a string of smaller possessions. The Spanish held Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and the vast mainland territories from Florida to Patagonia. The French controlled Saint-Domingue, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and a handful of other islands. The Dutch maintained footholds in Curaçao and Saint Martin. Each empire jealously guarded its possessions and coveted its neighbors. But the empires were stretched thin. The distances were immense. A message from London to Jamaica took 6 weeks minimum. A reply took another 6. A colonial governor who wrote to request instructions might wait a year before receiving an answer. In the meantime, he had to manage. He had to improvise. He had to make decisions that his superiors in Europe could not anticipate and would not understand. And the empires were fighting each other. The War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, was nominally about who would inherit the Spanish throne. In practice, it was about everything, about colonies and trade routes and the balance of power in Europe and the Americas. During the war years, thousands of English sailors served on privateers, ships licensed by the Crown to attack enemy commerce. These men were, in the eyes of the law, patriots. They sailed with letters of marque that authorized them to capture French and Spanish vessels. They brought their prizes into colonial ports, where the captured goods were sold at auction and the profits divided according to careful formulas. They were not pirates. They were licensed predators serving the interests of the Crown. Then the war ended. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, brought peace between England, France, and Spain. The privateering commissions expired. Suddenly, Thousands of experienced sailors, men who had spent years learning to capture ships at sea, men who knew the Caribbean currents and the shipping lanes and the vulnerabilities of merchant vessels, found themselves unemployed. The Royal Navy, contracting after the war, had no use for most of them. The merchant marine offered wages that seemed insulting after the potential prizes of privateering. The plantations offered brutal labor at worse pay still. Some of these men went home. Some found berths on legitimate vessels, and some decided that the skills they had developed in the king's service could be applied without the king's permission. They became pirates. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, was not supposed to be important. The island was small, roughly 50 miles long and 7 miles wide at its widest point, much of it swamp and scrubland. It had no significant agriculture. Its harbor, while serviceable, was not deep enough for the largest vessels. It had been colonized, abandoned, colonized again, sacked by the Spanish, resettled and abandoned once more, so many times that by 1700 it barely functioned as a settlement at all. The British technically claimed it, but the British had done nothing with it. The population, such as it was, consisted of a few hundred people, former colonists, shipwreck survivors, logwood cutters, turtlers, and assorted refugees from other Caribbean disasters. They lived in the ruins of earlier settlements, trading with passing ships when they could, surviving on sea turtles and wild pigs when they couldn't. But Nassau had one crucial advantage: no one cared about it. The Spanish, who sacked it periodically, did not bother to occupy it. The British, who nominally owned it, did not bother to govern it. The French and Dutch had no interest in it at all. It was, in the language of international relations, a vacuum. And in the years after the War of the Spanish Succession, that vacuum began to fill. The men who came to Nassau in 1713, 1714, 1715 were not random. They were the displaced veterans of the privateering war, experienced sailors, skilled fighters, men who had commanded vessels and led crews. They came with ships, small sloops and brigantines taken as prizes during the war or purchased with their earnings from it. They came with knowledge of the trade routes, the seasonal patterns, the choke points where merchant vessels were most vulnerable. They came with networks, connections to fences in other ports, to corrupt officials in colonial governments, to the shadowy merchants who bought stolen goods without asking questions. And they came with grievances. The peace that ended the war had been negotiated by diplomats in Europe, men who had never set foot on a Caribbean island, who had never gone months without pay, who had never watched a prize they had captured be confiscated by a colonial governor on some legal technicality. The sailors who had fought the war, who had bled for it, who had watched their friends die of fever and battle wounds and the 1,000 petty cruelties of life at sea, received nothing. No pensions, no land grants, no recognition. They were expected to return to civilian life, to accept the miserable wages of peacetime shipping, to pretend that the skills they had developed and the violence they had learned to perform were now irrelevant. Some of them refused. Benjamin Hornigold arrived in Nassau sometime around 1713 or 1714. The exact date is unclear. The exact circumstances of his arrival are lost. What we know is that by 1715 he had established himself as one of the leading figures in the emerging pirate community, a captain with a ship, a crew, and a growing reputation for both effectiveness and a certain rough code of conduct. He did not look like a revolutionary. He did not speak like one, as far as we can tell. He was, by all accounts, a practical man, a sailor and a fighter, not a philosopher or an ideologue. But what he built in Nassau over the next 3 years was something genuinely new. Not just a pirate haven. There had been pirate havens before, places where buccaneers gathered to sell their prizes and refit their ships. What Hornigold helped create was something more ambitious, a functioning community of pirates with its own informal governance, its own economic systems, its own way of resolving disputes and distributing resources. The pirates of Nassau did not call it a republic. That term came later, imposed by historians looking backward for convenient labels. But the structure they developed had genuinely republican elements. Captains were elected by their crews and could be deposed by vote. Prizes were divided according to agreed-upon formulas, with every man receiving a share and the captain receiving only slightly more than the common sailors. Disputes were settled by a form of rough counsel. The community as a whole made decisions about defense, about relations with the few remaining legitimate settlers, about which ships were acceptable targets and which were not. This last point was crucial, and it was the source of Benjamin Hornigold's eventual undoing. The Atlantic of 1715 was not a body of water crossed by schedules and shipping lanes in any modern sense. It was a wilderness, 3,000 miles of open ocean connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a triangular pattern of commerce that had transformed the economy of the Western world. From Europe went manufactured goods, weapons, cloth, and liquor. From Africa went human beings, captured and sold and shipped in conditions so brutal that mortality rates on the Middle Passage routinely exceeded 15%. From the Americas went sugar, tobacco, rum, indigo, cotton, and precious metals, the accumulated wealth extracted from stolen land by stolen labor. The ships that carried this commerce were vulnerable. They were slow, most of them, designed to carry cargo rather than to escape pursuit. They were lightly armed, their owners preferring to maximize cargo space rather than carry guns they hoped never to use. They sailed on predictable routes, following the currents and the trade winds that made Atlantic crossings possible, funneling through predictable choke points, the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, the Florida Straits between the peninsula and the Bahamas, the approaches to major ports like Havana and Cartagena and Port Royal. A pirate who understood these patterns, who knew where the shipping lanes converged, who could calculate the timing of the treasure fleets, who had informants in colonial ports feeding him intelligence about departures and cargoes, could intercept vessel after vessel with almost industrial efficiency. The risk was real. Naval patrols existed. Merchant ships sometimes fought back. Colonial authorities occasionally mounted expeditions. But the Caribbean was too large, the naval presence too thin, the commercial traffic too dense for the authorities to protect more than a fraction of the vulnerable shipping. Hornigold understood this calculus perfectly. He had spent years as a privateer learning to think in exactly these terms, to identify targets, to calculate approach angles, to assess the odds of a successful capture against the risks of resistance or pursuit. The difference now was that there was no letter of marque, no legal sanction, no share going to the crown. Everything he took was his and his crew's, minus what they chose to spend in Nassau and what they paid to the fences and suppliers who kept the pirate economy functioning. In 1715 and 1716, Hornigold ranged across the Caribbean and up the North American coast. The records are fragmentary, but the outlines are clear. He captured sloops. He captured merchant vessels. He took cargoes of every description, cloth and rum and manufactured goods, provisions and naval stores, occasionally hard currency and Spanish coin. His crews grew. His reputation spread. Other captains began to follow his lead, sailing in loose concert with his vessels, sharing information, and sometimes coordinating attacks. And then, something happened that changed the entire equation. In the summer of 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet sailed from Havana. 11 ships carrying the accumulated wealth of the Spanish-American Empire, silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico, gold and emeralds from New Granada, porcelain and silk from the Manila trade that crossed the Pacific to Acapulco, and then overland to Veracruz. The fleet was large, well-armed, escorted by warships. Under normal circumstances, it would have been essentially untouchable. The fleet did not reach Spain. A hurricane, one of the great storms that sweep through the Caribbean with terrible regularity, that the indigenous Taino people had named for the god of violent weather, struck the convoy off the coast of Florida. The ships were scattered, driven onto reefs and sandbars, smashed against the shore. Somewhere between 7 and 11 vessels went down, more than 1,000 sailors drowned, and millions of pesos worth of treasure, an amount so large that its loss caused financial reverberations in Madrid and London and Paris, sank into the shallow waters of the Florida coast. The Spanish, naturally, attempted to recover their wealth. Salvage camps were established. Divers were sent down. Slowly, painfully, treasure was brought back to the surface. The pirates heard about it. Within months, Nassau was organizing expeditions to the wreck sites. The treasure fleet salvage became the great prize of 1715 and 1716, a kind of underwater gold rush that drew pirates from across the Caribbean. They raided the salvage camps. They intercepted Spanish vessels carrying recovered treasure back to Havana. They dove on the wrecks themselves when they could, pulling coins and bars from the hulks that lay in 30 or 40 feet of water. Hornigold was involved, though the extent of his participation is unclear. What is certain is that the treasure fleet disaster accelerated everything. It brought more pirates to Nassau. It increased the wealth flowing through the community. It raised the stakes for everyone involved, for the pirates, for the colonial authorities, and for the empires whose commerce was being systematically plundered. By 1716, Nassau was home to perhaps 1,000 pirates, operating dozens of vessels, taking hundreds of prizes per year. The pirate community had become a genuine economic force, not large enough to threaten the empires directly, but large enough to disrupt trade, to raise insurance rates, to make colonial governors write increasingly alarmed letters to London about the menace gathering in the Bahamas. And, at the center of it, not the only captain, not the absolute leader, but the most influential figure, the one whose decisions shaped the community's direction, was Benjamin Hornigold. It was in these years that Hornigold took under his wing a young sailor who had recently arrived in Nassau. The man was tall, unusually so. Contemporary accounts describe him as a giant, though this may have been exaggeration or an artifact of the fear he inspired. He was strong, capable with weapons, and possessed of a certain theatrical flair that would later make him infamous. His name was Edward Teach, though he would become known to history by a different name. The relationship between Hornigold and Teach is poorly documented but clearly significant. Teach served under Hornigold's command. He learned the trade of piracy aboard Hornigold's vessels. He absorbed Hornigold's techniques for taking ships, the psychological warfare, the intimidation, the calculated use of violence to minimize actual fighting. He saw how Hornigold managed crews, distributed prizes, maintained the delicate balance of authority and consent that allowed a pirate captain to function. In 1716 or early 1717, Hornigold gave Teach his first independent command. It was a sloop, smaller than Hornigold's own vessel, sufficient for a beginning captain to prove himself. Teach did prove himself. He took prizes, he built a crew, he developed the persona that would make him legendary. The great black beard, the slow-burning fuses woven into his hair, the deliberate cultivation of a terrifying image that made merchant captains surrender without fighting. Hornigold had created him, had given him the tools and the opportunity and the first command, had launched the career that would end on the deck of a sloop in North Carolina in 1718, Teach's severed head hanging from the bowsprit of the vessel that killed him. But there was something else Hornigold gave Teach, something less tangible but equally important, a principle, a code, a line that Hornigold would not cross. Benjamin Hornigold refused to attack English ships. This was not a universal rule among the pirates of Nassau. Most of them took whatever prizes they could find. French, Spanish, Dutch, English, it made no difference. A ship was a ship. Cargo was cargo. The national flag flying at the stern was a matter of indifference to men who had renounced national allegiance altogether. But Hornigold was different. He was a patriot. Even as he robbed and plundered, even as he built an outlaw community that defied the authority of the crown, even as he trained men who would kill English sailors and burn English ships, he himself would not attack English vessels. He considered himself, in some strange way, still loyal, still English, still bound by obligations to a nation whose laws he was systematically violating. The sources record that his crew found this frustrating. They were in the business of taking prizes, and Hornigold's scruples meant passing up targets that any other captain would have attacked without hesitation. The Caribbean shipping lanes were full of English merchantmen, slow, lightly armed, carrying valuable cargoes. To let them sail past untouched while chasing Spanish ships that were fewer and often better defended seemed like commercial irrationality at best and moral confusion at worst. Hornigold held the line. For a time his authority was sufficient to enforce it, but authority among pirates was always contingent, always negotiated, always subject to the consent of the crew. A captain who consistently failed to deliver prizes or who refused to take prizes that were obviously available was a captain whose position was insecure. In 1717, the situation came to a head. The details are unclear, but the outcome is not. Hornigold's crew voted him out, deposed him, stripped him of his command because he would not take English ships. It was democracy in action, the democratic structures that the pirates had built turning against one of their founders, rejecting his peculiar loyalty to a nation that had offered him nothing in return. Hornigold did not leave Nassau immediately. He retained some followers, some influence, some remnant of his former position. But the moment marked a fundamental shift. The man who had done more than anyone to build the pirate republic was now, in some sense, alienated from it. The principle that had set him apart, his patriotism, his loyalty to an England that did not return his loyalty, had cost him his command. He could not have known, in that moment of humiliation, that the same loyalty would soon be rewarded beyond anything he might have imagined, that the crown he had never quite renounced would offer him a way back, that the skills he had developed in building the pirate republic would make him the perfect instrument for destroying it. But that was still months away. For now he was just a deposed captain, sitting in Nassau harbor, watching the community he had built evolve in directions he could no longer control. The ships came and went. The prizes arrived, were condemned, were sold. The population grew. More pirates, more support workers, more of the women and tradespeople and hangers-on who always gather where money flows freely. Edward Teach was out there somewhere, in his own ship now, building his own legend. Other captains, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, Samuel Bellamy, were rising to prominence, each with their own crews, their own methods, their own interpretations of what the pirate life meant. And across the Atlantic, in London, men in wigs and fine coats were discussing what to do about the problem of Nassau. Reports arrived, complaints accumulated. The merchants of London and Bristol, who had lost ships and cargoes, demanded action. The colonial governors, who could do nothing without resources they did not have, begged for naval support. The lords of trade and plantations, who were responsible for colonial administration, wrote memoranda and held meetings and eventually reached a decision. The crown would offer a pardon. Any pirate who surrendered voluntarily, who took an oath of allegiance and promised to renounce his criminal ways, would be forgiven. His past crimes would be erased. He would be free to return to legitimate society, to keep whatever wealth he had accumulated, to start over as though the piracy had never happened. It was an amnesty, an invitation to come in from the cold, a recognition that the pirate problem had grown too large to solve by force alone, that offering an alternative to the gallows might peel away enough pirates to weaken the rest. The man chosen to deliver this offer was named Woodes Rogers. He was a former privateer himself, a man who had circumnavigated the globe, who had fought battles and survived disasters and understood the mentality of the men he was being sent to convert. He would arrive in Nassau with ships, with soldiers, with the authority of the crown, and with the pardon that would give every pirate a choice. The pardon reached Nassau in the summer of 1718, and Benjamin Hornigold, the founder, the mentor, the man whose patriotism had cost him his command, was among the first to accept it. The morning was warm, the harbor was full of ships, and Hornigold stood on a quarterdeck, watching the settlement that he had helped create, knowing that everything was about to change. He could not have known that within 18 months Edward Teach would be dead, hunted down by a naval expedition that Hornigold had supported. He could not have known that Charles Vane would be captured, tried, and hanged, his body left to rot in a gibbet as a warning to others. He could not have known that the pirate republic, which had seemed so permanent, so firmly established, so much a feature of Caribbean geography as the islands themselves, would dissolve within a few years into scattered remnants and legends. He could not have known that he himself would spend his final years doing the work he was about to begin, hunting the men he had trained, tracking the ships he had once sailed alongside, helping to destroy the world he had made. What he knew that morning was simpler. He knew that a choice had arrived. He knew what his answer would be. The wind shifted. The tide began to turn. Somewhere in the harbor, a bell rang, a ship preparing to sail, a crew making ready for departure. Hornigold listened to the bell. He had heard that sound 1,000 times on 100 different mornings in ports scattered across the Atlantic world. It meant movement, it meant possibility. It meant that somewhere, out past the harbor mouth, the sea was waiting. He had always answered the call before. He would answer it again now, but this time, when he sailed, it would be under different colors. This time, when he hunted, he would be hunting men he knew. The sun climbed higher. The day grew warm. And in Nassau harbor, among the pirate ships and the rotting wharves and the ruins of the colonial town, a man who had been many things prepared to become something else. The pardon was not a piece of paper, not in the way that mattered. It was a piece of paper, yes, parchment actually, bearing the seal of George I, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and so on through the long litany of titles that monarchs accumulate. But what it represented was something else entirely. It was a door. It was a transaction. It was, if you understood it correctly, a recognition that the crown had lost control of its own waters and was now negotiating with the men who had taken them. Hornigold understood it correctly. The terms were simple. Any pirate who surrendered before September 5th, 1718, would receive a full pardon for all piratical offenses committed before January 5 of that year. He would not be tried. He would not be hanged. He would not have his property confiscated. He would simply be forgiven, as though the years of plunder had been a fever dream from which he was now waking, restored to his place in the legitimate order. In exchange, he had to swear an oath of allegiance, renounce piracy forever, and, this was the unspoken part, become useful to the crown in whatever capacity the crown required. Some pirates saw the pardon as surrender. They spat on it. Charles Vane, who had never been sentimental about nations or flags, organized a defiant departure from Nassau harbor on the very day Woodes Rogers arrived, firing on the governor's ships as he sailed past, a burning fire ship trailing smoke and fury in his wake. It was theatrical. It was magnificent in its way. It was also, as Vane would discover, a decision with consequences that would catch up to him on a Jamaican gallows 3 years later. Other pirates saw the pardon as opportunity. They calculated the odds, the increasing naval presence, the shrinking safe harbors, the simple mathematics of how long a man could raid before his luck ran out, and decided that forgiveness was a better gamble than persistence. They lined up to take the oath. They signed their names or made their marks. They became, in the eyes of the law, reformed men. Hornigold was among the first, but Hornigold was not seeking reformation. He was seeking something more interesting, a new career. The psychology here is worth examining. A man spends years building a criminal enterprise. He recruits and trains subordinates, he establishes operational patterns, he accumulates knowledge of ships, of routes, of tactics, of the men who practice them. This knowledge does not disappear when he takes an oath. It becomes, instead, an asset. And if the crown is wise, and the crown, through Woodes Rogers, was wise enough, it recognizes that the best person to catch a pirate is a man who knows how pirates think, because he used to be one. Rogers made Hornigold an offer, not immediately, not publicly, but soon after the pardon was administered. The governor needed men who could hunt. The Royal Navy was present but spread thin, its captains unfamiliar with the waters, its crews susceptible to the same diseases and desertions that plagued every European force in the Caribbean. What Rogers needed were local assets. Men who knew the shallow channels and hidden coves, men who could look at a sail on the horizon and recognize the ship, name the captain, predict where he was heading. Men who had contacts, informants, relationships forged in the criminal economy that could now be turned to other purposes. Hornigold was perfect. He had trained Edward Teach. He had sailed with Charles Vane. He knew the Bahamas the way a farmer knows his fields, every inlet, every anchorage, every patch of shoal water where a larger vessel could not follow. He knew which islands had fresh water and which had hidden fortifications. He knew the codes and signals that pirates used to identify one another. He knew, because he had helped write them, the unspoken rules by which the pirate republic operated, and he was willing to use all of it against the men who had been his colleagues. This is the turn. This is the hinge on which Hornigold's story pivots from one thing into another. The man who had refused to attack British ships out of some residual loyalty to the nation that had abandoned him would now hunt pirates with the full authority of that nation behind him. The mentor would become the executioner. The founder would become the demolition crew. Why? The sources do not tell us. They never do, not for the questions that matter. We have the external facts: the pardon accepted, the commission granted, the expeditions undertaken. But we do not have the internal ones. We do not have Hornigold's thoughts as he weighed the offer. We do not know if he felt guilt, relief, pragmatic satisfaction, or something more complicated than any of those. We cannot know if he saw the hunting of his former associates as betrayal or as duty, as the logical extension of his loyalism, or as its final ironic expression. What we can know is what he did. The first expedition sailed in December 1718. Rogers commissioned Hornigold to pursue Charles Vane, who had escaped Nassau and was raiding along the Carolina coast. Hornigold accepted the commission. He took 2 sloops, fast, shallow-draft vessels suited for the chase, and a crew of men, some of them former pirates themselves, all of them now operating under the legal cover of a government commission. They were privateers in a sense, or bounty hunters, or something in between. The hunt took months. Vane was elusive. He had learned from the same waters, the same teachers, the same experience. He knew the hiding places and the escape routes. He knew how to read a sail and how to disappear into the maze of islands that scattered across the Caribbean like broken teeth. Hornigold pursued him anyway, through the Bahamas, through the Florida Straits, up the coast toward the Carolinas. It was patient work, methodical, the kind of sustained pressure that required intimate knowledge of both the territory and the quarry. Hornigold did not catch Vane. That particular prey slipped away, eventually wrecking his ship in a hurricane and washing up on an island where he was recognized, arrested, and sent to Jamaica for trial. But the pursuit itself was significant. It demonstrated that Hornigold was serious. It demonstrated that the pardon had created not just reformed criminals, but active collaborators. It demonstrated that the pirate republic was being dismantled not only from without, but from within. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, Edward Teach was dying. The date was November 22, 1718. The place was Ocracoke Inlet, a shallow channel on the Outer Banks where Teach had anchored his sloop to careen and repair. The attackers were 2 vessels sent by Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, commanded by a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard. The battle was short, brutal, and definitive. Teach fought until he had received, according to the accounts, 5 pistol wounds and 20 cuts from swords and cutlasses. He died on the deck of his own ship, and Maynard ordered his head severed and hung from the bowsprit as proof of the kill. The man Hornigold had mentored, the protege who had become more famous than the master, was dead at approximately 38 years of age. His career as an independent pirate had lasted barely 2 years. Hornigold was not present at Ocracoke, but he was, in a sense, responsible. The information that led to Teach's location, the intelligence about his movements and his plans, flowed through networks that Hornigold helped to maintain. The hunters knew where to look because men like Hornigold, men who understood the pirate world from the inside, had told them. The student was killed by knowledge the teacher had provided. This is the thing about turning. It is not merely a personal decision. It has consequences that ripple outward, affecting people who made different choices, who trusted different loyalties, who assumed that the bonds of shared criminality would hold. When Hornigold took the pardon, he did not simply save himself. He became an instrument aimed at everyone who had not. His survival came at a cost, and the cost was paid by others. The winter of 1718-1719 was a season of endings. Teach was dead. Vane was captured. Stade Bonnet, the gentleman pirate who had briefly sailed with Teach, was hanged in Charleston. One by one, the major figures of the Nassau Republic were removed from the board, killed, captured, driven into distant waters, or persuaded to accept the pardon and retire. The republic that had seemed so robust, so permanent, so much a feature of the Atlantic world, was collapsing. Hornigold watched it happen. More than that, he helped it happen. He sailed under Rogers' commission. He tracked and pursued. He used his knowledge, his contacts, his understanding of pirate behavior to make the hunters more effective and the hunted less safe. He was by all accounts good at this work, the same skills that had made him a successful pirate captain. The tactical judgment, the reading of weather and water, the ability to anticipate what other sailors would do, made him a successful pirate hunter. He had simply changed his target. The moral calculus here is not simple. It never is with figures like Hornigold. On one hand, he was helping to end an era of maritime violence that had killed hundreds, disrupted trade, and created genuine suffering for sailors and merchants and colonists who wanted nothing more than to conduct their business in peace. On the other hand, he was betraying men who had trusted him, using intimacies against them, converting friendship into ammunition. He was, depending on your perspective, either a pragmatist who adapted to changed circumstances or a traitor who sold his former comrades for a pardon and a commission. The sources do not help us choose between these readings. They tell us what happened, but not what it meant. They give us the facts, but not the feelings. What they do tell us is that Hornigold's career as a hunter was effective but brief. He operated through the end of 1718 and into 1719, pursuing various targets across the Bahamas and the surrounding waters. He submitted reports to Rogers. He collected rewards. He played the role that Rogers had designed for him, the reformed pirate, as crown instrument, and he played it well. And then, sometime in 1719, he disappeared. The circumstances are uncertain. The most common account says that Hornigold was lost at sea, probably in a hurricane, probably somewhere near the coast of Central America. A storm came up. A ship went down. The sea, which had been his medium and his fortune, became his grave. No body was ever recovered. No wreckage was ever found. He simply ceased to appear in the records, and eventually people stopped looking for him. It is a fitting end in its way. Hornigold had lived by the sea. He had made his career on the water, first as a legitimate sailor, then as a privateer, then as a pirate, then as a pirate hunter. The sea had given him everything: wealth, status, purpose, a form of power that few men of his background could achieve. And the sea took it all back, in the end, as the sea always does. But before we reach that ending, we need to understand what Hornigold saw. We need to understand the world he moved through in those final months, the texture of life in the collapsing pirate republic, the specific decisions and specific moments that made up his existence as a hunter of men he had once called colleagues. Consider a morning in early 1719. The location is Nassau, or what remains of Nassau. Woodes Rogers has been governor for nearly a year. The changes are visible everywhere. The fortifications have been repaired. The streets, such as they are, have been cleared of the worst debris. Churches have been rebuilt, or at least buildings that serve as churches. There is an attempt at order, at regularity, at the forms of colonial administration that the pirates had abandoned. But the old world persists. You can see it in the faces of the men who drink in the remaining taverns, their eyes carrying memories of raids and prizes and the particular freedom that comes from living outside the law. You can see it in the ships anchored in the harbor, some legitimate merchants now, but others whose history is less clear, whose captains took the pardon but have not entirely forgotten the old ways. You can see it in the economy, which still runs partly on goods of uncertain provenance, on silver that may have been minted in Mexico or may have been taken from a Spanish ship, on cargo that has no papers, because papers would ask questions that no one wants to answer. Hornigold walks through this world. He knows it better than anyone. He helped to build it. He understands that the surface of reform is thin, that beneath the governors and the soldiers and the churches, the old structures persist. Men who took the pardon still drink together, still share information, still maintain networks of loyalty and obligation that the crown cannot see and would not understand if it could. They are reformed, yes. They have sworn oaths, yes. But they are also something else, something waiting, something watching, something calculating what will happen when Rogers leaves, or when the next war breaks out, or when the opportunity presents itself. Hornigold moves among them. He drinks with them, probably. He listens. He watches. And he reports what he learns to the governor, because that is his job now, because that is the bargain he has made. Is this treachery? or is it statecraft? The question has no clean answer. The Pirate Republic was never a utopia. It was a society organized around theft and violence, where disputes were settled by force and where the weakest paid for the freedom of the strongest. The ships that Hornigold's colleagues captured carried sailors who were often pressed into service against their will. Join the pirates or swim. The wealth that flowed through Nassau was built on terror, on the threat of violence, on the understanding that resistance would be met with cruelty. For all the democratic rhetoric of pirate articles and shared command, the Republic was not gentle with its enemies or its victims. So perhaps Hornigold, in hunting pirates, was simply switching from one form of violence to another. Perhaps he calculated that the Crown's violence was more sustainable, more predictable, more likely to create a world where he could live out his days in comfort. Perhaps he had no illusions about the morality of either side and simply chose the side that seemed more likely to win. Or perhaps there was genuine conversion. Perhaps the pardon worked as it was intended to work, not just as a legal mechanism, but as a psychological one, giving men a way to reimagine themselves, to tell a new story about who they were and what they had done. Perhaps Hornigold, taking the oath, felt something shift inside him, some alignment with the Crown that had always been latent and now became explicit. Perhaps his patriotism, that strange refusal to attack British ships that had cost him his command, was not an aberration, but the truest expression of who he had always been. A man who wanted, ultimately, to belong. We cannot know. The sources do not tell us. They give us the external facts, the pardon, the commission, the expeditions, and they leave the interior life to our imagination. What we can say is that Hornigold's turn mattered. It mattered because he was not just any pirate taking a pardon. He was a founder, a teacher, a figure of authority in the Republic he was now helping to destroy. When he accepted the pardon and took up the commission, he legitimized the entire enterprise of pirate hunting. He demonstrated that the reformed pirate was not merely a legal fiction, but a genuine possibility, that men could change, that the past could be forgiven, that the Crown's offer was made in good faith. Every pirate who saw Hornigold sailing under government colors had to ask himself, if he could do it, why can't I? Some followed, others did not. But the question was planted, and questions have a way of growing into decisions. Rogers, for his part, used Hornigold strategically. The governor understood that the pardon alone would not solve the pirate problem. It would peel away the wavering, the tired, the pragmatic. But the hardcore, the men like Vane, who refused to bend, would require force, and force required intelligence. It required knowing where the holdouts were, what they were planning, how they thought. It required, in short, exactly the kind of knowledge that Hornigold possessed. So the former pirate became the governor's instrument. He hunted, he reported, he interpreted the movements and intentions of men who had once been his colleagues. He translated the pirate world for the officials who were trying to destroy it. And in doing so, he accelerated the collapse that was already underway. By the end of 1719, the Nassau Pirate Republic was effectively dead. The major captains were gone, dead, captured, scattered. The ships had dispersed. The community that had formed in the harbor, that strange congregation of outcasts and opportunists, had dissolved. Some pirates took the pardon and became settlers, farmers, fishermen, legitimate traders. Others fled to distant waters, Madagascar, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, where the Crown's reach was weaker and the hunting was better. A few continued to operate in the Caribbean, but they were remnants, isolated operators, no longer part of a coherent movement or community. The Republic had lasted, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 3 and 7 years. It had been, for a brief moment, something genuinely new, a society of equals, or at least a society that pretended to be equal, operating outside the structures of European authority, governing itself by its own rules, creating its own forms of justice and distribution. It had drawn men from every nation and every background, united by nothing but the shared understanding that the sea was free and that those who sailed it had a right to take what they could. And then it ended. Not with a single battle or a decisive moment, but gradually, as such things usually end, by attrition, by pressure, by the slow accumulation of force and incentive until the old ways became unsustainable and the new ways became unavoidable. Hornigold had been present at the beginning, he had been instrumental in the middle, and he helped to bring about the end. That is his legacy, such as it is, a man who was many things to many purposes, who served different masters at different times, who built and then destroyed, who taught and then betrayed. He was not a hero, he was not a villain, he was something more unsettling than either, a man who saw clearly what was possible in each moment and acted on what he saw. The sea took him before he could be anything else. A storm, somewhere off the coast of Honduras or Nicaragua or the Yucatan. The accounts vary, and none of them are reliable. His ship went down, his crew went with him. The waters that had carried him to fortune and infamy became, in the end, his resting place. No one knows exactly where. The ocean does not mark its graves. The tides shift, the currents move, and what lies on the bottom is gradually buried by sediment and time. Somewhere in the Western Caribbean, among the coral and the sand and the slow creatures that move in the deep places, the remains of Benjamin Hornigold, the founder, the mentor, the hunter, settled into silence. The world above continued. Ships still sailed. Trade still flowed. Other men rose and fell and were forgotten in their turn. The memory of the pirate republic faded into legend, becoming something that scholars argued about and storytellers embellished and children played at. The reality gradually obscured by the romance that accumulated around it. But for a few years, in a place that existed among men who were real, something had been attempted. A different way of organizing life at sea, a different understanding of who had the right to rule and who had to obey. It failed, as such experiments usually fail, crushed by the weight of empires and the logic of power. But it happened. That much we can say with certainty. It happened, and Benjamin Hornigold was there, and the story of what he did and why he did it is part of the larger story that we carry forward, whether we remember his name or not. The wind still blows across Nassau Harbor. The water still catches the light, and somewhere beneath the surface, in waters that have forgotten nothing and remembered nothing, the past waits, silent, patient, complete. The story could end there. In a certain sense, it should end there, with Hornigold's bones scattered across the seafloor and the republic he helped build reduced to tavern songs and scholarly footnotes. That would be the clean ending, the satisfying ending, the ending that respects the shape of a life as it was actually lived. But history is rarely so accommodating. The story of Benjamin Hornigold does not end with his death, because the consequences of his choices continued to ripple outward long after the Caribbean swallowed him whole. And to understand those consequences, to see fully what he set in motion, we have to turn our attention to the man he taught, Edward Teach. The name has become so encrusted with legend that it is difficult now to see the person beneath. He's been rendered in 1,000 paintings and 100 films, his image so fixed in the popular imagination that he seems less like a historical figure than a character from folklore. The black beard braided with ribbons and smoking fuses, the bandoliers of pistols, the wild eyes, the demonic presence that terrorized the Atlantic coast. He has become, in the centuries since his death, the archetype itself. When a child thinks of a pirate, the image that forms is usually some version of Edward Teach. He is the template, the standard against which all other pirates are measured. But before he was Blackbeard, before he was legend, before he was anything at all, he was a sailor aboard Benjamin Hornigold's ship, learning the trade, watching the master work. The details of Teach's early life are frustratingly sparse. He was born in Bristol, probably, sometime around 1680, though some accounts place his birth in Jamaica or Carolina, and the date could be off by several years in either direction. Bristol was one of the great maritime cities of the age, a hub of the Atlantic trade, its docks crowded with ships bound for Africa and the Americas and the Caribbean. A boy growing up there would have absorbed the sea through his pores, would have known from childhood the smell of tar and salt and rotting fish, the sound of rigging creaking in the wind, the sight of tall ships coming and going with the tides. Whether he went to sea as a boy or waited until manhood, the sea was always going to claim him. The only question was in what capacity. The first records that mention him with any specificity place him aboard a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession. The same war that produced Hornigold, the same war that produced the entire generation of men who would later become pirates. He served on ships licensed to attack French and Spanish vessels, learning seamanship and gunnery and the particular skills required to board an enemy ship and take it by force. He was good at it. The records suggest that he rose through the ranks quickly, earning recognition for his courage and his competence. By the time the war ended and the privateering licenses were revoked, Edward Teach was an experienced combat sailor without a legal outlet for his skills. The path from there to Hornigold's crew is not documented. We can only reconstruct it from inference and probability. Teach was in the Caribbean in the years immediately following the war's end. Nassau was the obvious destination for a man of his background and inclinations, the one place where his skills were still valued, where his experience still counted for something, where the distinction between legal and illegal violence had been effectively dissolved. He arrived sometime around 1716, probably, and fell in with the community of former privateers and emerging pirates who were already congregating around New Providence Island. Hornigold was the dominant figure in that community. He commanded the most powerful ship. He led the most successful raids. He had the most extensive network of contacts and allies. For an ambitious newcomer looking to learn the pirate trade from someone who knew it well, Hornigold was the obvious choice. How they met, what their first conversation was like, what Hornigold saw in Teach that made him decide to take him on. None of this survives. The records that exist from this period are fragmentary and often contradictory, created by men who had no interest in documenting the internal dynamics of pirate crews. What we know is that by 1717, Edward Teach was serving aboard Hornigold's ship, learning from him, watching him, absorbing the methods and the mindset that would later make him infamous. Think about what that means. Think about what Hornigold was teaching. Not just the technical skills, the navigation, the gunnery, the tactics of ship-to-ship combat, though he taught those too. Teach was learning something more fundamental. He was learning how to project terror. He was learning how to make a reputation work for you, how to cultivate an image so fearsome that ships would surrender without a fight, how to weaponize the stories that sailors told about you in port. He was learning that piracy was as much a performance as it was a profession, that the appearance of invincibility was often more valuable than actual invincibility. Hornigold understood this. His success had never depended solely on firepower or numbers. It had depended on the careful cultivation of a reputation that preceded him wherever he sailed. Ships surrendered to Hornigold because they had heard what happened to ships that didn't surrender to Hornigold. Merchants handed over their cargo because they had been told that resistance was futile and cooperation was rewarded. The violence was real, but the threat of violence did most of the work. Teach watched, Teach learned, and when his time came, he would take these lessons and amplify them beyond anything Hornigold had imagined. But that was still in the future. In 1717, Teach was still an apprentice, still proving himself, still working his way up through the informal hierarchy of Hornigold's crew. He demonstrated his value on raid after raid, showing courage under fire, showing tactical intelligence, showing the ability to command men in the chaos of combat. Hornigold noticed. By the autumn of that year, he had given Teach command of his own vessel, a sloop that had been captured during one of their joint operations. It was a small ship, nothing impressive, but it was his. He was no longer a crew member. He was a captain. The gift came with Hornigold's blessing and, presumably, his expectations. Teach was being elevated within the network that Hornigold had built, given resources and authority, trusted to operate independently while remaining connected to the larger enterprise. He was being groomed, in effect, for a leadership role in the loose confederation of pirates that Hornigold had done so much to create. What happened next tells us something important about both men. Teach took his new command and immediately began to build his own reputation. He grew out his beard, that famous beard, black and thick and wild, which he would later learn to weaponize with burning fuses woven into it during combat. He adopted the persona that would become legendary, the theatrical menace, the calculated madness, the appearance of a man who might do anything at any moment. He began to establish himself as a figure distinct from Hornigold, someone to be feared in his own right, and he began to raid. Not the careful, selective raiding that Hornigold preferred, the strategic acquisition of supplies and cargo, the avoidance of unnecessary violence, the protection of British vessels. Teach raided everyone. British ships, French ships, Spanish ships, Dutch ships, merchantmen, slavers, fishing vessels. He took what he wanted from whoever had it, without regard for nationality or flag. The restraint that Hornigold had always shown, that principled refusal to attack ships flying the Union Jack, meant nothing to Teach. He was a pirate, and he would act like one. This divergence matters. It tells us that whatever Teach learned from Hornigold, he did not learn everything. The patriotism, or the pragmatism disguised as patriotism, that had defined Hornigold's career was never transmitted to his most famous student. Teach took the skills and discarded the principles. He kept the methods and rejected the limitations. We cannot know what Hornigold thought about this. The records are silent, but it is not difficult to imagine his reaction as reports began to filter back of his former protege, attacking British vessels, burning British cargo, terrorizing British merchants. The man he had trained, the man he had elevated, the man he had trusted, using everything Hornigold had taught him in direct violation of the one rule Hornigold had always maintained. Perhaps this was inevitable. Perhaps Hornigold should have seen it coming. The pirate trade attracted men who rejected authority and convention, who had no patience for half measures or divided loyalties. A man willing to become a pirate was, almost by definition, a man who had already decided that the rules of legitimate society did not apply to him. Why would he honor an arbitrary distinction between French targets and British ones? Why would he limit his potential profits out of loyalty to a crown that had declared him a criminal? Teach's rejection of Hornigold's principles was, in a sense, simply the logical completion of what Hornigold himself had started. You cannot build a republic of the lawless and then expect its citizens to obey laws you impose on them. By late 1717, the paths of the two men had begun to diverge. Hornigold was still operating out of Nassau, still commanding respect among the pirate community, still maintaining his peculiar code. Teach was ranging further afield, establishing himself as an independent operator, building his own crew and his own network of contacts. They were no longer sailing together. The mentor-student relationship had run its course. And then came the king's pardon. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in the summer of 1718, offering amnesty to any pirate who would surrender and swear to forsake the trade, Hornigold was among the first to accept. He had always been calculating, always been pragmatic, always been attentive to the shifting currents of power and opportunity. He could see that the golden age was ending, that the weight of empire was descending on the Caribbean, that the brief window of freedom that had made the pirate republic possible was closing. He took the pardon because the pardon was the smart move. Teach did not. When word reached him of Rogers's offer, Teach made a different calculation. He was at the height of his powers, commanding a powerful ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slaver that he had captured and converted into a warship bristling with 40 guns. He had a crew of 300 men, a reputation that made merchants tremble, a string of successful raids that had filled his holds with plunder. Why would he surrender all of that for the promise of amnesty? Why would he trust a government that had declared him an outlaw? He refused the pardon. He continued to raid, and in doing so, he became the most wanted pirate in the Atlantic. The paths of the two men now diverged completely. Hornigold, pardoned and legitimized, was transformed into a pirate hunter. Rogers needed men who knew how pirates thought, who knew where they hid, who knew the waters and the tactics and the mindset of the quarry. Hornigold was ideal. He knew everything. He had built much of what he was now being asked to destroy. There is something almost unbearable about this phase of the story. Hornigold hunting pirates. Hornigold sailing the same waters he had once dominated, but now in service of the crown rather than in defiance of it. Hornigold using all the knowledge he had accumulated, the secret harbors, the reliable contacts, the behavioral patterns, to track down and capture the men who had once been his allies. Did he hunt Teach? The records are unclear. Rogers certainly wanted Teach captured. He was the most famous and most feared pirate still operating, a symbol of everything the new colonial government was trying to suppress, and Hornigold was Rogers's most effective agent, the hunter with the deepest knowledge of the prey. It would have been natural for Rogers to assign Hornigold to the Teach pursuit, but there is no evidence that Hornigold ever directly confronted his former student. Whether this was by chance or by choice, whether he avoided the encounter deliberately or simply never had the opportunity, we cannot say. The possibility hangs there, unanswered. The mentor who became a hunter, the student who became the hunted. The confrontation that may have happened, or may not have, in waters that kept no record. What we do know is that Teach met his end not at Hornigold's hands, but at those of Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. On November 22nd, 1718, in a shallow inlet off the coast of North Carolina, Maynard's two sloops cornered the Queen Anne's Revenge. The battle was brutal and close quarters. Teach boarded Maynard's vessel himself, fighting with pistol and cutlass, receiving wound after wound. 5 gunshot wounds, 20 sword cuts, according to the account that would later circulate, before finally falling. Maynard's men cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of their ship as proof of their victory. They sailed back to Virginia with the trophy dangling in the salt wind, and the most famous pirate of the Golden Age was finished. Hornigold was still alive when this happened, still hunting, still serving Rogers, still using his knowledge of the pirate world to dismantle what remained of it. What did he think when he heard the news? What did he feel when he learned that the man he had trained, the man he had given a ship, the man who had taken his methods and exceeded his ambitions, that this man had been killed and beheaded by officers of the crown? Relief, perhaps. The most dangerous pirate in the Caribbean was dead, and the task that Hornigold had committed himself to was that much closer to completion. Or perhaps something else, something more complicated. The student he had taught was gone, and with him went one of the last connections to what Hornigold himself had once been. Every pirate that fell, every ship that was captured, every man who was hanged or killed in combat, each one erased a little more of the world that Hornigold had helped create. He was, in a very real sense, erasing himself. Every hunt was an act of self-destruction, a further severing of the ties that bound him to his own past. This is the paradox at the heart of Hornigold's later career. He was effective precisely because of what he had been. He could hunt pirates because he had been a pirate. He could anticipate their movements because he thought the way they thought. His value to Rogers lay entirely in his criminal experience, the same experience that made him a criminal in the first place. He had been purchased, in effect, with a pardon, and now he was being used to purchase others. The Crown had found a way to turn his knowledge against his former comrades, to weaponize his past for its own purposes. There is no evidence that Hornigold resisted this, no evidence that he felt remorse or reluctance or divided loyalty. He hunted with apparent dedication and considerable success, capturing multiple ships and crews, earning commendations from Rogers, establishing himself as the most effective pirate hunter in the Caribbean. But effectiveness is not the same as contentment. We cannot see into his mind. We cannot know what he thought during the long watches of the night, sailing waters he had once ruled, hunting men who had once been his allies. The records tell us what he did. They do not tell us what it cost him. The storms that ended his life came sometime in 1719, probably in the autumn or early winter, though the exact date is disputed. He was hunting pirates, that much is certain, when his ship was caught by a hurricane somewhere in the western Caribbean. The ship went down. The crew went down. Hornigold went down with them. The sea that killed him kept no monument. No wreckage was recovered, no bodies found, no precise location marked on any chart. Somewhere between the Bahamas and the coast of Mexico, in waters that pirates and merchants and naval officers had all learned to fear during hurricane season, Benjamin Hornigold simply ceased to be. The most successful pirate hunter in the Caribbean vanished as completely as any of the men he had hunted. The ocean made no distinction between the pardoned and the condemned. Rogers received the news sometime in late 1719 or early 1720, The records are imprecise on this point as on so many others. His most valuable asset was gone. His former pirate, his chief enforcer, the man whose knowledge of the trade routes and hideaways and tactics of Caribbean piracy had made the suppression campaign possible, had been swallowed by the same sea that had made his career possible in the first place. There would be no body to bury, no grave to mark, no official record of the passing beyond a brief notation in administrative correspondence. Hornigold had lived as a pirate lives, in motion, in danger, in the margins of documentation. He died the same way. What survived him was not a legacy in any conventional sense. He left no heirs that we know of, no estate, no memoir, no final testament. What he left was something more diffuse and more durable, a model, a proof of concept, a demonstration that the line between pirate and pirate hunter was not a wall but a door, and that the door could swing in either direction. The Crown had learned something from Hornigold, something it would use again and again in the decades to come. It had learned that the most effective weapon against irregular warfare is irregular warriors who have switched sides. This was not a new idea in 1719. Governments had always sought to turn outlaws into enforcers when it suited their purposes. But the Caribbean experiment, the Nassau experiment, the Hornigold experiment, these showed how the process could be formalized. Offer amnesty, recruit the skilled, deploy them against the holdouts. The men who refused the pardon become targets for the men who accepted it. The brotherhood of piracy, such as it was, could be dissolved from within. Former allies became hunters and hunted, and the state barely needed to maintain a naval presence at all. It could outsource the violence to converted criminals who knew the waters and the methods better than any officer trained in conventional warfare. Rogers understood this, and so did the men in London who had backed his expedition. The Nassau model would be replicated in various forms across the British Empire and beyond. The pardon as weapon, the turned pirate as instrument. Hornigold was not the only example, but he was perhaps the clearest one, the man whose trajectory from pirate captain to pirate hunter was most complete and most effective. He had shown what was possible when a man with knowledge and skill and local credibility chose, or was induced to choose, the side of official authority. But this legacy, such as it was, carried its own complications. The converted pirate was always, in some sense, a double figure. His value lay precisely in his criminal past, the knowledge and connections that made him useful to the Crown. But that same past meant he could never be fully trusted, never be fully incorporated into the official hierarchy. Hornigold received commendations from Rogers, apparently earned his respect, functioned as something like an unofficial naval captain during the hunting expeditions. But he was never given a commission, never brought into the formal structure of the Royal Navy or colonial administration. He remained what he had always been, a man operating in the spaces between official categories, useful but not legitimate, effective but not honored. This pattern, too, would repeat itself across the colonial world. The converted outlaw, the turned rebel, the native informant, these figures would be used and then discarded, celebrated for their effectiveness and despised for their origins, essential to the functioning of empire and excluded from its rewards. Hornigold was an early example of a type that would become familiar, the man who could not go back to what he had been and could not fully become what he now served. The pirate republic he had founded outlived him, in a sense, though not in the form he might have imagined. Nassau remained a center of maritime activity, but the character of that activity changed fundamentally in the years following Rogers' arrival. The pirates who refused the pardon scattered. Some fled to more distant waters, Madagascar, the Red Sea, the coast of Africa. Some were captured and hanged. Some, like Charles Vane, made brief attempts to continue operating in the Caribbean before meeting violent ends. The community that had gathered on New Providence, the rough democracy of the beach, the Republic of Thieves, all of this dispersed like smoke in a changing wind. What remained was something more conventional, a colonial outpost, a naval station, a port town governed by appointed officials and regulated by British law. The same harbor that had sheltered pirate prizes now sheltered merchant vessels. The same beaches where crews had divided plunder now supported legitimate commerce. The transformation, was not immediate or complete. Piracy would continue in various forms for decades, and Nassau would retain something of its rough reputation for years to come. But the fundamental character of the place had changed. The experiment was over. And yet the memory persisted. The stories that sailors told, the accounts that made their way into print, the legends that would grow over the following centuries, these kept the Nassau pirates alive in ways that no physical settlement could match. Blackbeard became the archetype, the image that would dominate popular imagination for 300 years. His beard, his fuses, his extravagant violence. These details, some of them probably invented, some of them possibly true, would become the default image of what a pirate was supposed to be. The man Hornigold had trained became the symbol of everything Hornigold had turned against. This is the strange afterlife of historical figures. They cannot control what people remember about them. Hornigold, who was by any reasonable measure more important to the Nassau pirate community than Teach, who founded the settlement and organized its defenses and created the conditions under which men like Blackbeard could flourish, is largely forgotten. His name appears in specialist histories, in academic treatments of the Golden Age, in occasional footnotes to larger narratives about more famous figures. But he never captured the popular imagination the way his student did. The mentor is always less memorable than the legend he created. There are reasons for this, and they are not mysterious. Blackbeard was theatrical in ways that Hornigold apparently was not. He cultivated an image, a persona, a performance of piracy that was designed to terrify and impress. The smoking fuses, the multiple pistols, the enormous black beard. These were branding, in a sense, marketing for an era before anyone used those words. Hornigold, so far as we can tell, did none of this. He was a pirate of the older style, practical and businesslike, more interested in profits than in reputation. He was effective, but not colorful. He was important but not interesting, at least not in the way that popular memory tends to find interesting. And there is the matter of his end. Blackbeard died in battle, fighting against overwhelming odds, taking wound after wound before finally falling. His head was cut off and displayed as a trophy. This is the death of a storybook pirate, dramatic and violent and definitive. Hornigold died in a storm, probably alone, certainly unremarked. His body never recovered, and his fate not even precisely dated. There is no drama in drowning. There is no climax in being caught by weather that kills indiscriminately. The storm that took him did not care who he was or what he had done. It simply killed him and moved on and left no trace. The same Caribbean waters that had made his career possible, the same trade winds and shipping lanes and island hideaways that he had used for years became his grave. There is something appropriate in this, if you are inclined to look for appropriateness in random events. The sea gave Hornigold his life as a pirate and took it away again when his time as a pirate hunter was done. The instrument that had enriched him destroyed him. The medium of his power became the means of his death. But we should be careful about reading too much meaning into coincidence. The hurricane that killed Hornigold was not justice, not irony, not narrative resolution. It was weather. It was a physical phenomenon that follows its own laws and cares nothing for human significance. Men caught in hurricanes die. This is what hurricanes do. Hornigold happened to be caught. The fact that he had once been a pirate and was now a pirate hunter added nothing to the physics of the situation. The wind that sank his ship did not know his biography. This is one of the things that historical study requires us to accept. The universe does not organize itself around human meaning. Events happen because of causes, not because of themes. The patterns we see in lives and careers and historical periods, the ironies, the tragic arcs, the poetic symmetries, these are patterns we impose on chaos, not patterns we discover in it. Hornigold's death was not meaningful. It was merely the end of a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing work that required him to be in dangerous waters during dangerous seasons. What we can say, without imposing too much meaning, is that his death marked the effective end of an era. By 1719, the Nassau Pirate Republic was finished. By 1720, The great captains of the Golden Age were dead or scattered or converted to the other side. The fleets that had once terrorized Caribbean shipping were reduced to scattered vessels operating alone or in pairs, hunted by former colleagues like Hornigold and by the increasingly effective naval patrols that the Crown was now willing to fund. The experiment had failed or succeeded, depending on whose perspective you adopt. From the pirates' perspective, of course, it had failed. The Republic had been a brief flourishing, a few years when men who would otherwise have been common sailors or minor criminals had been able to live outside the ordinary structures of power. They had governed themselves, after a fashion. They had accumulated wealth that would never have come to them through legitimate channels. They had defied the empires of Europe and taken what they wanted from ships that sailed under the protection of distant kings. And then the empires had reasserted themselves, the pardons had been offered, the diehards had been hanged, and everything had returned to something like normal. From the perspective of those empires, it had succeeded. The Caribbean trade routes were secure again. The merchants could sail without fear of capture. The plantations could ship their sugar, and the slave ships could deliver their cargoes without interference. The brief disorder had been corrected. The system had demonstrated its resilience. A few years of piracy, in the end, had changed nothing fundamental about the distribution of power in the Atlantic world. But there's a third perspective, one that neither the pirates nor the empires fully occupied. Call it the perspective of history, or of hindsight, or simply of distance. From this perspective, the Nassau experiment looks different. It looks like a moment when the structures of empire revealed their fragility. A few hundred men, operating from a single island, had managed to disrupt the most profitable trade routes in the world for nearly a decade. They had forced the British Crown to divert resources, to negotiate, to make deals. They had demonstrated that power is not a fixed thing, but a relationship, and that relationships can be disrupted by those with sufficient will and sufficient skill. The lesson was not lost on later revolutionaries, later rebels, later challengers of empire. The men who would eventually tear apart the European colonial systems in the Americas and beyond. They too would begin from positions of apparent weakness. They too would exploit the vulnerabilities of overextended empires. They too would force the powerful to negotiate. The pirates of Nassau were not revolutionaries in any ideological sense. They were thieves. But the methods they demonstrated, the exploitation of geography, the recruitment of disaffected manpower, the strategic use of violence against commercial targets, these would be studied and adapted by later movements with very different aims. Hornigold himself would have been puzzled by this reading of his career. He did not think of himself as a revolutionary or a pioneer or a historical example. He thought of himself as a man making a living in the margins of empire, first by stealing from it and then by serving it. His politics, such as they were entirely personal. Loyalty to England in some vague sense, hostility to foreign powers, a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances when the alternative was death or imprisonment. He was not trying to make a point, he was trying to survive. But history does not require its subjects to understand their own significance. The effects of actions outlast the intentions behind them. Hornigold's refusal to attack British ships, his insistence on this strange scruple in the midst of general criminality, reveals something about the limits of pirate solidarity. His acceptance of the pardon reveals something about the vulnerabilities of outlaw communities. His effectiveness as a pirate hunter reveals something about the convertibility of criminal knowledge to state purposes. These revelations persist, whether Hornigold understood them or not. The waters where he died continued to carry ships for centuries after his death. The trade routes he had preyed upon evolved and expanded and eventually gave way to newer forms of commerce. The island where he had built his republic became an ordinary colonial possession, then part of an independent nation, then a tourist destination where visitors could pay money to see romanticized versions of the pirate past. The names of his contemporaries, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bonnie, became the subjects of novels and films and theme park attractions. The violence and brutality of the actual pirate life was transformed into entertainment, scrubbed of its blood and cruelty and reduced to adventure. Hornigold, as noted, does not appear much in these entertainments. He is too complicated, perhaps, too morally ambiguous, even for stories that claim to celebrate outlaws. A pirate who becomes a pirate hunter is difficult to romanticize. He cannot be simply admired the way popular culture wants to admire its pirates. He cannot be simply condemned either, because his later service to the crown complicates the picture. He is neither hero nor villain, but something messier, a man who changed sides when it suited him, who served whichever power offered him the best chance of survival, who left behind no clear moral lesson. This messiness is perhaps the truest thing about him. Real lives do not resolve into clean narratives. Real people contain contradictions that no story can fully accommodate. Hornigold was a pirate and a patriot, a criminal and an officer, a founder and a destroyer. He built a republic of thieves and then tore it down. He trained the most famous pirate in history and then hunted his former colleagues until the sea took him. There is no single frame that contains all of this. There is no moral that emerges cleanly from the contradictions. What remains is the outline of a life lived in the spaces between official categories. A life that the documentation illuminates only in fragments. A life that ended somewhere in the Western Caribbean, in waters that kept no record and offered no grave. The storms of 1719 scattered what was left of Hornigold across the ocean floor, and the currents carried away whatever traces might have told us more about who he was and what he thought, and why he made the choices he made. The silence that follows is not an accident of incomplete records. It is, in some sense, the natural end of a career spent in the margins. Men like Hornigold leave traces only when they intersect with official power, when they are captured or pardoned or employed or killed in ways that generate documentation. The vast majority of their lives, the watches kept, the meals eaten, the conversations held, the doubts entertained, the fears endured, all of this vanishes because no one thought it worth recording. We know the outline of his career. We do not know the man. This, too, is part of history's lesson. The past is not equally visible. Some lives leave monuments in memoirs and extensive correspondence. Others leave fragments and inferences and silence. The factors that determine which lives are remembered are not necessarily related to the importance of those lives. Hornigold mattered more than many figures who are better documented. He shaped events that would echo for centuries, but the records that would tell us who he really was do not exist and cannot be reconstructed and must simply be acknowledged as losses. Somewhere in the Caribbean, in waters that are warmer and bluer than the North Atlantic that produced him, whatever remains of Benjamin Hornigold rests on the ocean floor. The ship that carried him is gone. The crew that served him is gone. The storms that killed them have long since dissipated into the general circulation of the atmosphere. What remains is the story, incomplete and fragmentary and full of gaps, of a man who helped build a world and then helped tear it down. The Caribbean that Hornigold left behind did not remain static. The pirate republic he had helped to found, the one he had worked to destroy, continued to transform even after his death. Nassau itself would become something else entirely within a generation. A proper colonial port, respectable and regulated, its wild years folded into legend and then into the kind of half-remembered folklore that travelers would encounter in taverns along the waterfront. The men and women who had once made it a republic of thieves were dead or scattered or absorbed into the legitimate economy of empire. The transformation Hornigold had served was complete, but the consequences of the Nassau years extended far beyond the Bahamas. The pirates who had operated from that harbor during its brief flowering had disrupted Atlantic commerce so thoroughly that they forced a permanent change in how European powers protected their shipping. The convoy system, already in use during wartime, became more rigorous. Naval patrols increased. The legal framework for prosecuting piracy was strengthened and standardized across colonial jurisdictions. Insurance markets adapted. Merchant captains learned new defensive tactics. The entire commercial architecture of the Atlantic world was rebuilt in part because of what had happened in Nassau between 1714 and 1718. This is what Hornigold helped to create, and what he then helped to destroy. The destruction was not complete. Piracy would continue in various forms for decades, would never entirely disappear. But the particular moment of mass piracy, the brief window when hundreds of vessels operated with near impunity from a self-governing republic, that moment ended. It ended because of Rogers and his Marines, because of the pardons that split the pirate community, because of the executions that demonstrated the cost of continued resistance. And it ended because former pirates like Hornigold hunted their erstwhile brothers across the same waters where they had once sailed together. The irony is not lost to history, even if it was not remarked upon at the time. A pirate republic destroyed by pardoned pirates. A brotherhood of thieves undone by members who accepted employment from the very powers they had robbed. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the colonial era in various forms, as empires learned that the most effective suppressors of irregular warfare were often former practitioners. Who better to track a pirate than someone who knew how pirates thought? Who better to anticipate their tactics than someone who had used those tactics? The logic was sound, even if it raised questions about loyalty and identity that the official records preferred not to examine. Hornigold's effectiveness as a pirate hunter suggests that he brought more than just local knowledge to his new role. He understood the psychology of the men he pursued. He knew what they feared, what they hoped for, what would break their resistance. He knew the arguments they would make to themselves and to each other as the pressure mounted. He had made those arguments himself, presumably, in the months before the pardon arrived, when it was already becoming clear that the golden age was ending. Perhaps he remembered those conversations when he tracked former colleagues through the channels of the Bahamas. Perhaps he used that memory to predict where they would hide, how long they would hold out when they would finally decide that surrender was preferable to death. We do not know what he said to the pirates he captured. We do not know whether he offered them advice, whether he urged them to accept the pardon as he had, whether he maintained the fiction that they were simply criminals being brought to justice, or acknowledged the more complicated truth that he was one of them, transformed by circumstance and calculation into their enemy. The documentation does not record these conversations. What it records is the outcome. Pirates captured, pirates hanged, the waters gradually cleared. The hanging tree in Nassau saw regular use in those years. The bodies displayed there were meant to serve as warnings, their decay a public demonstration of what happened to those who refused the king's mercy. Some of the men who swung from those branches had certainly known Hornigold. Some had perhaps sailed with him, shared meals with him, fought alongside him in the taking of prizes. Now they hung in the harbor while he sailed past on the king's business, and whatever he thought as he saw them there, he kept to himself. This is the aspect of Hornigold's story that resists easy interpretation. The practical benefits of switching sides are obvious: survival, legitimacy, regular pay, the possibility of a future that did not end on the gallows. But the human cost is harder to calculate. What does it do to a man to hunt his former friends? What internal adjustments are required to watch former allies executed and then return to the same work that put them there? The historical record does not address these questions because the men who kept the records were not interested in the interior lives of reformed pirates. They were interested in results. Hornigold delivered results. That was enough. But if we are to understand him as a human being rather than simply as an instrument of policy, we must at least acknowledge the weight of what he did. Every pirate he captured was someone who had made the same choice he once made: to reject the constraints of legal society and seek fortune through robbery. Every execution he facilitated was the death of someone who had once been, in some meaningful sense, his brother. The Brotherhood of the Coast was a real thing, not just a romantic invention of later storytellers. Men who sailed together, fought together, risked death together, developed bonds that were not easily broken. Hornigold broke them anyway. He broke them systematically and professionally until there were no more of his former brothers left to break. This does not make him a villain. It does not make him a hero either. It makes him a man who made choices under constraints that we can only partially reconstruct. The constraints were real. The pardon was limited. The Navy was present. The executions had begun. To refuse the pardon was to choose almost certain death. To accept it and then refuse to serve against former allies was to invite suspicion, to be categorized as unreliable, to forfeit the benefits of legitimacy. The logic of the situation pushed toward the choices Hornigold made. But logic is not destiny. Other men, facing similar pressures, made different choices. Some refused the pardon and fought until they were killed. Some accepted the pardon, but then returned to piracy, preferring the risk of death to the certainty of betraying their companions. Hornigold chose differently. He chose survival and service and the gradual transformation from outlaw to officer. The weather of the Caribbean, that humid weight that pressed on everyone who lived there in the early 18th century, that constant presence of potential storms, of squalls appearing on the horizon with little warning, of the sea turning suddenly from flat calm to churning danger. This weather shaped everything that happened in those waters. European ships were not designed for it. European bodies were not adapted to it. The diseases that flourished in that climate killed more sailors than combat ever did. The storms that swept through every hurricane season reshaped coastlines, sank fleets, ended careers. Hornigold had learned to read this weather during his years as a pirate. He knew its rhythms and its dangers. He knew that the sea was not a surface to be crossed, but an environment to be navigated, constantly changing, never fully predictable. This knowledge served him as a pirate hunter, just as it had served him as a pirate. But in the end, the weather took him anyway. The hurricane that killed him was not unusual by Caribbean standards. Such storms struck every year, sometimes multiple times per season. They were a known risk, factored into every calculation made by anyone who earned a living on those waters. Ships took precautions. Captains learned to read the signs of approaching storms, the particular quality of the light, the behavior of birds, the swell patterns that preceded the wind. But precautions could not guarantee safety. Storms struck without regard for experience or preparation. They killed the skilled and the unskilled alike, the veteran and the newcomer, the pirate and the merchant and the naval officer. The sea was not interested in human categories. It took what it took. Hornigold's death was thus both ordinary and symbolic. Ordinary because hurricanes killed many sailors every year. Symbolic because the sea that had given him his career, that had made possible both his piracy and his redemption, was also the agent of his end. He was not hanged like so many of his former colleagues. He was not killed in battle like Blackbeard. He was taken by the element he had spent his adult life navigating. There's a kind of fitness in this, though we should be careful not to impose meaning where there may have been only random misfortune. The storm did not know who Hornigold was. The sea did not care about his history or his contradictions. It was simply weather, doing what weather does. The wreck has never been found. Treasure hunters and archaeologists have searched the waters off Mexico and Honduras, looking for the remains of ships that went down in the storms of 1719. Some wrecks have been located, though identification is often uncertain. Whether any of them is Hornigold's vessel, we do not know. The sea floor in that region is littered with the remains of ships that met their ends over centuries of maritime activity. Sorting through them, identifying particular vessels, connecting physical remains to historical records, this work continues slowly and may eventually produce answers. Or it may not. The ocean keeps its own counsel. What would we learn if we found the wreck? The artifacts that survived would tell us something about the material conditions of Hornigold's final voyage. Weapons, if any survived, would tell us about the ship's armament. Navigation instruments would tell us about the technology available. Personal effects, if any could be recovered and identified, might tell us something about the men who sailed on that vessel. But the things we most want to know, what Hornigold thought, what he felt, how he understood his own life, these things do not survive in physical form. They were never written down, never carved into material that would endure. They existed only in his mind, and that mind was extinguished in a storm more than 3 centuries ago. The other pirates who survived the suppression met various fates. Some retired successfully, using their accumulated wealth to buy respectability in colonies where their past was not well known. Some were eventually caught and executed years after accepting pardons that had stipulated good behavior. Some disappeared into the Caribbean's vast network of small islands and hidden harbors, living out their days in obscurity. The documentation trails thin as we move away from the dramatic years of 1716, 1719. The pirates who did not become famous, who did not die spectacularly, who simply aged and faded. These men left few traces. Charles Vane, who had most dramatically rejected the pardon, was eventually captured in 1719. His ship was wrecked in a storm, the same hurricane season that killed Hornigold, though the exact storm may have been different. Vane survived the wreck but was marooned on a small island in the Bay of Honduras. A passing ship eventually rescued him, but one of the sailors recognized him, and he was taken to Jamaica in chains. He was tried and hanged in Port Royal in March of 1721, more than 2 years after Hornigold's death. If he ever learned that Hornigold had died, there is no record of his reaction. The two men had been colleagues and then enemies, fellow pirates, and then opposing forces in a civil war within the pirate community. Vane had chosen defiance. Hornigold had chosen accommodation. Vane ended on the gallows. Hornigold ended on the sea floor. Neither ending was preferable to the other. Neither man got to choose the manner of his death. Blackbeard's death in November 1718 had preceded Hornigold's by roughly a year. The battle off Ocracoke Inlet, where Lieutenant Maynard of the Royal Navy finally cornered the most famous pirate of the age, has been described many times, rendered in paintings and engravings, dramatized in countless retellings. The image of Blackbeard's severed head hanging from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop has become one of the defining images of the pirate era. But what is often forgotten is that Blackbeard had reached Ocracoke in part because the other options had closed off. Nassau was no longer available. The pardon he had briefly accepted had been revoked when he returned to piracy. The naval patrols were tightening. The space for independent operation was shrinking. He was cornered not just by Maynard's sloop but by the whole structure of imperial suppression that Rogers had initiated, that Hornigold had served. In this sense, Hornigold contributed to Blackbeard's death, though he was not present at the battle. The system that Hornigold served was the system that killed his former protege. The navy that Maynard represented was the same navy that employed Hornigold. The policy of suppression that ended at Ocracoke was the same policy that Hornigold enforced in the Bahamas. The teacher's later loyalty to the crown contributed to the student's violent end. This is not a comfortable relationship to contemplate. It does not fit the narrative patterns we prefer. We want mentors and protégés to remain connected, to share fates, to be found on the same side at the end. Hornigold and Blackbeard ended on opposite sides, serving opposing interests, and one contributed to the machinery that destroyed the other. But there is another way to view this relationship, a way that does not require us to judge either man's choices. Both Hornigold and Blackbeard were products of the same historical moment. Both emerged from the chaos of the post-war Caribbean, the surplus of sailors, the shortage of legitimate employment, the opportunity for theft on a grand scale. Both made decisions that were rational given their circumstances. Both were destroyed, eventually, by forces larger than themselves, the storm that took Hornigold, the naval suppression that cornered Blackbeard. Neither could have sustained his position indefinitely. The pirate moment was closing, regardless of what any individual chose. Some died fighting, some died serving the crown. The end result was the same. The sea reclaimed them all. The Nassau that exists today bears little resemblance to the pirate republic. It is a modern city, a cruise ship destination, a place where tourists come to swim and shop, and perhaps visit a museum that tells a sanitized version of the pirate story. The waterfront where Hornigold once anchored is now lined with hotels and restaurants. The harbor where prizes were divided is now filled with pleasure craft. The transformation is complete, so complete that it requires active effort to remember what once happened there. A few street names preserve echoes, a few tourist attractions invoke the pirate past, but the actual physical infrastructure of the Republic is gone, rebuilt, and rebuilt again over 3 centuries of development. This is what happens to places that become commercially valuable. The past is demolished to make room for the present. The buildings that Hornigold knew, the fortifications he built, the taverns where pirates gathered, all of it is gone, replaced by structures that serve modern purposes. Archaeologists occasionally find traces when construction disturbs older layers of ground. A foundation here, a midden heap there, a scatter of artifacts that suggest the kinds of activities that once took place. But the systematic reconstruction of Nassau's pirate-era layout is impossible. Too much has been destroyed. Too little was documented, even at the time. What remains is not a place, but an idea. The idea that for a brief moment, roughly 5 years, a group of men who rejected every legitimate authority managed to govern themselves. They created rules. They distributed resources. They maintained something resembling order in a place that had no king, no parliament, no appointed authority of any kind. The experiment failed. It was always going to fail. But the fact that it happened at all tells us something about the range of human possibility, about what becomes imaginable when the structures that normally constrain behavior temporarily collapse. Hornigold stood at the center of that experiment, and then he stood at the center of its suppression. Both positions were his, not because he was inconsistent, but because he was consistent in ways that are difficult for us to recognize. He followed the logic of his circumstances. When piracy was the rational choice, he was a pirate. When legitimacy became available and piracy became untenable, he became legitimate. He did not agonize over identity or loyalty in the way that later narratives would expect him to. He adapted. He survived. He served whatever structure offered him a place within it. This pragmatism makes him a difficult figure to romanticize. Blackbeard is easier. Blackbeard committed to the role. He built himself into a character, a performance of piratical menace that transcended mere criminality and became something like art. When he died in character, fighting hand-to-hand on the deck of his sloop, refusing surrender even when wounded multiple times, embodying the myth he had created. That death could be painted. That death could become legend. Hornigold's death defies dramatization. A ship caught in a storm, a reef that tore through the hull, water rushing into the hold, no enemy to fight, no final words recorded, no witnesses who survived to tell the story. Just a man who had spent his life at sea meeting the end that all sailors fear. The sea simply taking him, without drama, without meaning, without any of the narrative structure that we require to make sense of a life. The hurricane that killed Hornigold in late 1719 was not unusual for that time and place. The Bahamas lie in hurricane territory. Ships were lost every season. The Spanish treasure fleets that had drawn pirates to the Caribbean in the first place were themselves regularly devastated by storms. The 1715 fleet disaster that had created the initial wave of wealth for Nassau's pirates was itself a hurricane's work. The sea gave, and the sea took away. Hornigold had benefited from the storms that wrecked Spanish ships. He died in the same kind of storm. There is a symmetry there, though not one that offers any comfort. His ship was hunting pirates when it went down. The exact circumstances are unclear because no one survived to report them. What we know comes from the fact that the ship did not return, from the wreckage that eventually washed ashore, from the absence of any further records of Benjamin Hornigold after 1719. He disappeared from history the way most people disappear, not with a dramatic exit, but with a simple cessation. One day he existed. The next day he did not. The paperwork stopped. The name stopped appearing in correspondence. The hunter was hunted by the only force that could not be outmaneuvered. Governor Rogers recorded the loss in his official communications, noting that one of his most effective pirate hunters had been lost at sea. The tone of these records is matter of fact. Ships were lost regularly. Men died at sea. The business of colonial administration continued. Hornigold's death created a gap in Rogers' enforcement capacity, but the gap was filled. Other captains took up the work. The suppression campaign continued. By 1720, the pirate republic was a memory. By 1725, the golden age of piracy was over. The seas were safe for commerce, at least safe enough that insurance rates dropped and merchant captains stopped carrying so many guns, and the whole economic structure of Atlantic trade could operate without factoring in systematic theft. This was Hornigold's legacy, though he did not live to see its completion. The transformation he served, from pirate haven to legitimate colony, from open lawlessness to imperial order, continued after his death. Rogers struggled for years to make Nassau economically viable. He went bankrupt personally. He was recalled to England, returned to the Bahamas, died there in 1732, still fighting to establish the kind of orderly colonial society that the empire demanded. The work was hard. The work was never finished, but the pirate moment was over, and it never returned. What did return eventually was something stranger. The myth. As the actual pirates died, hanged, drowned, killed in battle, or simply fading into obscure deaths in obscure places, their stories began to circulate in new forms. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 while some of the principals were still alive, became the foundational text of pirate mythology. Johnson, whose identity remains uncertain, possibly a pseudonym, possibly Daniel Defoe, possibly someone else entirely, compiled accounts of the major pirate figures and turned them into literature. Blackbeard features prominently. His dramatic death, his fearsome appearance, his supposed cruelties and audacities all appear in forms that would echo through 3 centuries of popular culture. Hornigold appears as well, but briefly. A few pages. A supporting character in Blackbeard's rise. A name that appears in lists but does not capture the imagination. This is the price of pragmatism. The dramatic figures, the ones who committed fully, who burned brightly and died spectacularly, became legends. The calculating figures, the ones who shifted with circumstances, who survived by adaptation rather than defiance, became footnotes. Hornigold's actual importance to the pirate republic exceeds Blackbeard's. He was there first. He built the structures. He trained the next generation. He shaped the institutional forms that made Nassau function. But institutional founders rarely become legends. Legends require sacrifice. Legends require a refusal to compromise. Legends require death at the hands of the enemy rather than death in a storm while serving that same enemy. And yet the absence of legend does not mean the absence of significance. Hornigold's career illuminates aspects of the pirate moment that the legendary figures obscure. His patriotism, his refusal to attack British ships even when doing so would have been profitable and tactically sensible, reveals that these men carried their national identities with them into piracy. They did not simply become stateless criminals. They remained in their own minds subjects of the crown, engaged in a kind of irregular warfare against the crown's enemies. The fact that the crown did not recognize this status, that the law made no distinction between a privateer who attacked French ships and a pirate who attacked British ones, did not change how some pirates understood themselves. Hornigold's patriotism was not anachronistic sentimentality. It was a theory of his own legitimacy, a way of maintaining moral distinction between himself and other criminals. The theory was wrong, the crown did not agree, but it was sincerely held. His acceptance of the pardon, too, reveals something about the relationship between pirates and empire that the dramatic resistors obscure. Rogers came to Nassau expecting to fight. He brought warships. He prepared for siege. What he found instead was a majority of pirates who were desperate for a way back into legitimate society. They had not become pirates because they wanted to be outlaws. They had become pirates because the legitimate opportunities had closed off. When those opportunities reopened, when the king offered a pardon and the governor offered employment, most of them took it. They wanted to come in from the cold. They wanted to stop running. They wanted the security of law, even if it meant the end of freedom. Hornigold was unusual, only in his effectiveness after the pardon. Most of the pardoned pirates simply faded into obscurity, took up fishing, took up small trade, disappeared into the colonial population. Hornigold became a hunter, and a skilled one. His knowledge of pirate tactics, his familiarity with the hiding places and supply routes, his personal acquaintance with many of the men he now pursued, all of this made him valuable. He was a traitor to his former colleagues in the most practical possible sense. He used what he knew to help destroy them. We do not know what Hornigold felt about this work. The sources do not record his internal life. We have only the external facts. He accepted the commission, he pursued the ships, he captured or killed the men he found. Whether he felt guilt, satisfaction, or nothing at all is beyond recovery. We cannot even know whether he saw the work as betrayal or as the natural continuation of a career that had always been about serving his own interests within whatever structures were available. He had served himself as a pirate. He served himself as a hunter. The flag changed. Perhaps nothing else did. But there is a cruelty to this progression that deserves acknowledgement. The men he hunted had been his companions. Some of them had sailed under his command. Some of them had learned the trade from him just as Blackbeard had. When he captured Stede Bonnet's former crew member, when he brought in the small captains and anonymous sailors who had refused the pardon, he was capturing men who had trusted him, who had operated within the structures he had helped build. The betrayal was not abstract. It was personal. It had faces and names, and Hornigold did it anyway because that was the work available to him, and he was not the kind of man who refused available work for sentimental reasons. This is the edge where judgment becomes difficult. We can understand Hornigold's pragmatism. We can even admire its consistency. But we cannot pretend that it was costless. Men died because of his effectiveness. Men who might have escaped, might have taken up legitimate work elsewhere, might have faded into the same obscurity as the other pardoned pirates. These men were caught because Hornigold knew where to look and how to pursue. He traded their lives for his own security. That trade was rational. It may even have been inevitable given his circumstances. But it was a trade, and we should not look away from what was exchanged. The storm that killed him interrupted this work, but did not end it. The suppression campaign continued. The last major pirate strongholds were eliminated in the early 1720s. Madagascar, which had served as a pirate base for decades, was no longer viable. The West African coast, where pirates had operated with impunity, came under increased naval patrol. The Indian Ocean pirates, who had once plundered the Mughal fleets and lived like princes on their stolen wealth, were hunted to extinction. By 1730, large-scale piracy of the kind that Hornigold had practiced was essentially over. Individual pirates continued to operate, have always continued to operate, down to the present day. But the systemic threat, the organized theft that could interdict major trade routes, was suppressed. The suppression worked because it addressed the underlying conditions. The end of the War of Spanish Succession had created the pirate problem by dumping thousands of trained sailors into unemployment. The post-war economic expansion gradually reabsorbed them. The merchant fleet grew. The Navy maintained wartime manning levels. The colonial economies developed. There were jobs again, not pleasant jobs, not well-paid jobs, but jobs that did not require the constant risk of hanging. As the legitimate opportunities expanded, the appeal of piracy diminished. The men who had chosen theft because no other option existed now had other options. They took them. This does not mean that the pirates were simply economically rational actors who would have preferred legitimate work all along. Some of them genuinely preferred the freedom of piracy to the discipline of naval or merchant service. Some of them had committed crimes that put them beyond any pardon's reach. Some of them had developed habits and identities that could not survive the transition to orderly employment. These men had to be killed or captured because they would not surrender. But they were a minority. The majority, the bulk of the 1,000 or more men who had operated out of Nassau at its peak, accepted the pardons, returned to legitimate life, and vanished from the historical record. Hornigold's effectiveness as a hunter was made possible by this broader transition. He was not single-handedly suppressing an industry. He was participating in a structural shift that was happening anyway. His contribution was to accelerate the process in the Bahamas specifically, to make Nassau too dangerous for pirates to use as a base, to demonstrate that the pardon was genuine and the punishment for those who refused it was real. He was an example, both of the clemency available and of the consequences of rejecting it. Look at Hornigold, the governor's offers implied. He was one of you. Now he serves us. You can serve us too, or you can face him. The example worked. Nassau never reverted to piracy. Even after Rogers's first recall, even during the periods of administrative confusion that followed, the structural transformation held. The pirates did not return. The merchants did. The plantations expanded. The slave economy that would define Bahamian society for the next century and a half took root. The transformation that Hornigold served was not from piracy to freedom, but from piracy to a different kind of exploitation, legal, systematized, protected by the same naval power that had suppressed the pirates. The world that emerged from the pirate suppression was not a better world by any standard that values human freedom or dignity. It was simply a more orderly world, one where the violence was monopolized by the state rather than distributed among independent operators. Hornigold did not think in these terms. No one did at the time. The slave trade was simply a fact of Caribbean existence, as unremarkable as the weather, as deeply embedded in economic assumptions as we today are embedded in assumptions that future generations will likely find monstrous. To judge Hornigold for serving a system built on slavery is to apply a standard that no one in his world could have met. But to ignore the slavery, to tell the pirate story as if it were simply a colorful adventure that ended with the restoration of legitimate order, is to falsify history in a different way. The order that was restored was a slave order. The commerce that was protected was slave commerce. The empire that triumphed was a slave empire. We do not have to condemn Hornigold personally to acknowledge that the cause he served was not one that deserves celebration. The water off Nassau today is clear and warm. Tourists snorkel above the reefs where ships once anchored. The harbor that sheltered pirate sloops now shelters cruise ships, enormous vessels carrying thousands of passengers who will spend a few hours shopping and swimming before returning to their floating hotels. The economy has changed. Tourism instead of plunder, service instead of theft. But the fundamental relationship to the sea remains. Nassau exists because of the sea. It always has. The pirates knew this. The colonizers who displaced them knew this. The modern developers know this too. Somewhere beneath that water, perhaps, lie traces of Hornigold's final ship. The reefs of the Bahamas have claimed thousands of vessels over the centuries. Some have been found. Most have not. The archaeological record of Caribbean shipwrecks is vast but fragmentary, and the specific wreck that carried Hornigold to his death has never been identified. It may no longer exist as a coherent site. 3 centuries of storm and current and marine growth can reduce a wooden ship to scattered fragments indistinguishable from the other debris that accumulates on any reef. Or it may lie intact beneath accumulated sand, waiting for some future expedition to disturb its rest. It does not matter. The ship is not the man. The man is not the memory. The memory is not the history. Each is a different thing, and none of them survives intact. What we have are fragments, a name in documents, a role in events, a few decisions that shaped outcomes, an absence where a person once was. From these fragments we construct the story we can tell, knowing that the story is incomplete, that the man himself is beyond our reach, that the past does not yield to our desire for understanding. Benjamin Hornigold was born. He became a pirate. He helped build a republic. He surrendered that republic to the crown. He hunted his former colleagues. He died in a storm. These are the facts. Everything else is interpretation, necessary interpretation, unavoidable interpretation, but interpretation nonetheless. We do not know what he wanted. We do not know what he believed. We do not know whether he died satisfied or regretful, whether he thought of Blackbeard in his final moments, whether he thought of anything at all beyond the water rushing in and the ship breaking apart and the darkness that comes for everyone eventually. The sea took him, as the sea takes all sailors eventually, as the sea took the republic he founded and the student he trained and the world he knew. It was not personal. The sea is never personal. It simply is, vast, indifferent, the medium through which all of this history moved and the grave in which so much of it lies. A man sailed out. A man did not return. The documents recorded the loss and moved on to other matters. The suppression continued. The empire expanded. The merchants prospered. And somewhere in the dark water, in the space between what was and what we can know, Benjamin Hornigold found his rest. He is there still. The sea keeps what it takes.